The neighborhood was the kind of place that appeared picture-perfect on the surface, the kind of community people dreamed of moving into when they imagined safety, order, and peace. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns stretched across the cul-de-sac, each house almost identical in its architectural design. Fresh coats of paint glistened under the sun, and flower beds framed each pathway like a stage set for suburban bliss. At the center of it all, the Homeowners Association held its invisible grip, enforcing order with an iron fist masked as neighborly concern. For most residents, this balance of conformity and control was tolerable, even welcome. But for James Whitaker, a retired Army veteran who had spent the last 30 years of his life serving his country, the rules of the HOA were suffocating. He had bought his home in the neighborhood with the promise of peace and stability in his retirement, imagining mornings on the porch with his coffee afternoons, tending to his small garden, and evenings walking his dog along the quiet streets. He wanted normalcy, a calm life after years of deployments, separation, and sacrifice. James had lived through more than most of his neighbors could ever comprehend. He had faced deserts and jungles, battlefields and hospitals. He carried the weight of medals and scars alike. Yet as he settled into his new life, he discovered that the enemy he now faced was not on foreign soil, but in his own neighborhood. A group of board members who seemed to take pleasure in asserting their dominance over every small detail of their residents' lives. At first, it was small things. Notices taped to his door reminding him that his trash can was left out a few hours too long. Letters informing him that his mailbox did not meet the aesthetic requirements of the community. Fines for a lawn ornament that was apparently 2 inches taller than the guidelines allowed. He found these irritating, but he complied, hoping that following the rules would keep the peace. But James also valued his independence, and he refused to live in constant fear of bureaucratic nitpicking. He wanted to plant a flagpole in his yard, a modest structure to proudly display the American flag he had saluted countless times throughout his career. For him, it wasn't just a decoration, it was a symbol of the sacrifices he and his fellow soldiers had made. Yet when he submitted the request for approval, the HOA denied it. Citing community uniformity, James felt the sting of disrespect but remained composed. Choosing to quietly install the pole anyway, the flag waved proudly in his yard, drawing the attention of neighbors, some who admired it, others who whispered complaints. The HOA board was not amused. They sent warnings, escalating to fines, each one harsher than the last. James stood his ground, refusing to take the flag down. To him, it wasn't negotiable. This act of defiance marked the beginning of a war that James never asked for, but was prepared to fight. The HOA's retaliation grew harsher. They scrutinized every aspect of his property. His grass was declared too tall by less than an inch. His shutters, painted a muted shade of blue, were suddenly non-compliant with the approved palette. They filed liens against his property when he refused to pay their mounting fines. What had once been a peaceful retirement home began to feel like a battlefield of paperwork and threats. Neighbors watched the conflict unfold with unease. Some admired James for standing firm, whispering words of encouragement when no one from the board could hear. Others distanced themselves, fearful of drawing the HOA's ire. The board members themselves seemed relentless, empowered by their authority, determined to break him into submission. James, however, was no stranger to pressure. His years of discipline and endurance had prepared him for struggles much greater than this. He refused to bow to intimidation, but as the months dragged on, the HOA escalated their tactics. Notices turned into legal actions, letters turned into official court filings, and then came the day that shook him to his core. The HOA announced that his property was being seized. It happened swiftly, without the courtesy of a human face delivering the news. A letter, stamped with official seals, informed him that his repeated violations, unpaid fines, and legal defiance had given the board the authority to foreclose on his home. His sanctuary, the place he had purchased with his hard-earned retirement, was no longer considered his own. James stood on his porch, letter in hand, staring out at the flag fluttering in the wind. Memories of foreign lands and comrades lost filled his mind. He had survived too much, fought too hard, and sacrificed too deeply to be stripped of his dignity in this way. The HOA thought they had won, that their grip on the neighborhood was unshakable. But they had underestimated the man they were dealing with. For James, this was no longer about lawn ornaments or paint colors. It was about principle, justice, and the very rights he had sworn to defend. They wanted to take his home. They wanted to erase his independence. But James had fought bigger battles than this, and he knew how to prepare for war. He picked up the phone, his resolve stronger than it had ever been since retiring. The HOA had crossed a line, and James was ready to fight back, not with words taped to a door or fines scribbled on paper, but with the full weight of the legal system. If they wanted a war, he would give them one. And so, with the stroke of a pen and the determination of a soldier who refused to yield, James Whitaker filed a lawsuit against the HOA that had tried to strip him of everything he had earned. The battle for his property and his dignity had just begun. The lawsuit landed like a thunderclap in the quiet suburban streets. Neighbors who had grown accustomed to gossiping about lawn heights and parking violations now whispered about legal filings, court dates, and the boldness of one man who dared to take on the all-powerful HOA. James Whitaker's name spread quickly, spoken in hushed tones at neighborhood barbecues, in late-night text chains, and across the back fences of manicured yards. For the HOA board, the news was both shocking and infuriating. They had expected James to crumble under the weight of fines and legal threats. They had counted on his compliance, on his silence. But instead, he had done the unthinkable. He had fought back, and not just with angry words, but with a legal case that directly challenged their authority. The complaint was straightforward but devastating. It accused the HOA of overstepping its boundaries, of abusing its power, and of unlawfully seizing property that was rightfully James's. His attorney, a sharp and seasoned litigator with a history of handling homeowner disputes, wasted no time in pointing out the holes in the HOA's procedures. The liens, the fines, the foreclosure, every step had been carried out with a confidence that now seemed reckless. If the court sided with James, the entire board could be exposed, not just for poor judgment but for illegal conduct. Word of the lawsuit rattled the community. Some homeowners felt a flicker of hope. They had lived under the HOA's scrutiny for years, quietly paying fines and enduring harassment, believing they had no choice. If James won, perhaps it would set a precedent, loosening the stranglehold the board held over them. Others worried about the consequences, fearing that siding with James would draw retaliation. Still, the once united facade of the neighborhood was beginning to fracture. James himself remained composed. He had lived through firefights and command briefings, and this legal battle, though daunting, was one he approached with the same discipline that had carried him through war. He gathered documents, records, photographs, and testimonies. He knew his case would need evidence gold, undeniable proof of the HOA's overreach. He spent long nights reviewing paperwork, recalling every notice, every letter, every threat they had sent him. Each one became a weapon in his arsenal. The HOA, however, was not about to back down. The board president, a woman whose stern demeanor had long intimidated residents, called emergency meetings. They hired their own legal team, a group of lawyers skilled in defending homeowner associations. Their strategy was clear: paint James as a defiant troublemaker who had refused to follow simple community rules. They wanted to frame the case not as an abuse of power, but as the inevitable consequence of one man's stubbornness. Court filings flew back and forth, motions were made, deadlines set, and a trial date loomed. The legal system moved slowly, but tension in the neighborhood grew quickly. The sight of James walking his dog or tending to his garden became a silent reminder to everyone that a storm was brewing. The HOA members, once casual faces at community events, now seemed distant, watching their neighbors as if trying to gauge who might turn against them. Meanwhile, local media caught wind of the story. A retired veteran suing his HOA after they seized his property was the kind of headline that drew attention. Small outlets ran articles, and soon larger networks picked it up. Cameras began appearing near the entrance of the community, reporters eager to capture footage of the quiet neighborhood at the heart of a growing controversy. Residents found themselves asked for comments, and while many declined, a few bravely spoke up, hinting at years of frustration with the board's rigid control. James never sought fame, but the coverage worked in his favor. Public sympathy grew, painting him as a man standing against injustice. Veterans groups reached out in solidarity, offering both moral and financial support. What had started as one man's stand was beginning to swell into a movement, a challenge not just against his HOA, but against the unchecked power such associations held across countless communities. The HOA board, on the other hand, found themselves on the defensive. Their once ironclad authority now looked fragile under the harsh light of public scrutiny. The board president issued carefully worded statements, insisting that their actions were in the best interest of maintaining order. But the more they spoke, the more people began to question their motives. For James, this was a test of endurance. He had fought battles that dragged on for months, even years, and he understood that victory often went to those who could withstand the grind. He kept to his routine, refusing to let the stress consume him. Yet late at night, when the neighborhood was quiet and the weight of the fight settled heavily on his shoulders, he felt the loneliness of standing against a machine built to crush dissent. But James was not alone, not entirely. Slowly, neighbors began to approach him not with bold declarations, but with small gestures. A nod of encouragement when passing on the street. A note slipped into his mailbox thanking him for his courage. An envelope with anonymous contributions to his legal fund. These signs, though quiet, reminded him that his fight mattered not just for himself but for everyone who had felt the HOA's oppressive hand. As the trial date approached, the stakes became clear. This was no longer about a flagpole or a law violation. It was about power, principle, and the fundamental right of a man to call his house his home. The courtroom would decide whether the HOA had the right to strip him of that, or whether James Whitaker's stand would become a victory for homeowners everywhere. The day of the first hearing arrived, and with it, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Residents peeked from behind curtains as James walked to his car in a pressed suit, his lawyer waiting to accompany him. The board members gathered separately, grim and resolute, their expressions betraying both confidence and unease. The courthouse doors opened, and the battle that had consumed their neighborhood was about. The courthouse had an air of gravity that pressed on everyone who entered its doors. Its stone columns, worn by decades of footsteps, loomed tall and unyielding, as if to remind all who entered that justice was not a matter of convenience, but of principle. For James Whitaker, the walk into the courtroom felt familiar in an odd way. It reminded him of the moments before a mission, quiet, tense, and heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. The room was filled with an energy that only comes when a community's private dispute becomes a public spectacle. Journalists lined the benches in the back, their pens and cameras poised to capture every development. A handful of neighbors slipped into the audience as well, some out of curiosity, others out of solidarity. The HOA board members arrived as a group, dressed in coordinated business attire, their faces tight with resolve. At their center sat the board president, exuding the controlled calm of someone who believed rules were on her side. James sat with his attorney at the plaintiff's table. He appeared calm, though his hands rested firmly on the table, steady and unmoving, a subtle reminder of the discipline drilled into him from years of service. His lawyer whispered a few words, but James's focus remained on the judge entering the room, the one person who would ultimately decide whether he had been wronged, or whether the HOA's authority was untouchable. The opening arguments set the tone. The HOA's counsel painted James as a chronic rule breaker, a man unwilling to follow the same standards as his neighbors. They presented him as reckless, stubborn, and defiant, someone whose disregard for the bylaws left the board with no choice but to act. Their words were carefully chosen, meant to frame the foreclosure not as cruelty, but as an unfortunate necessity. But then came James's side of the story. His attorney spoke with measured conviction, outlining the pattern of harassment and overreach, the denial of his flagpole request, the escalating fines, the liens filed without proper notice. All of it painted a picture not of order, but of abuse. Exhibits were introduced, letters from the HOA, filled with threats, photographs of James's property that showed no true violations, and testimony from neighbors who admitted they had felt too afraid to speak up until now. The courtroom listened as the attorney described how the foreclosure had been rushed, bypassing procedures meant to protect homeowners. The HOA, in their eagerness to assert authority, had ignored key legal safeguards. The words hung heavy in the air: unlawful seizure, Witnesses took the stand. One neighbor, hesitant at first, admitted that James's flagpole had been the subject of heated whispers in the community, but she also confessed that many admired it, seeing it as a symbol of pride rather than disruption. Another resident described how they, too, had been fined for minor infractions, but had paid out of fear rather than resistance. Each story chipped away at the board's image of fairness and consistency. The board members themselves were eventually called. Their answers, rehearsed and polished, began to falter under cross-examination. When asked why James's shutters had suddenly been deemed non-compliant after years of approval, they stumbled. When pressed on why liens had been filed without giving him a fair opportunity to appeal, their explanations grew thin. The judge, usually stoic, furrowed his brow more than once, signaling that the cracks in the HOA's defense were becoming visible. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to attract attention. Reporters broadcast live updates, and headlines framed the battle as veteran versus HOA, a fight for property rights. Strangers sent messages of encouragement to James, and veterans' organizations spoke out in his support. The more the case unfolded, the more the HOA's reputation deteriorated in the public eye. Back inside, the tension only grew. On one day of testimony, the HOA's attorney tried to portray James as aggressive, citing a heated exchange he had once had with a board member. But James's lawyer countered by pointing to his spotless military record, letters of commendation, and the testimonials of fellow servicemen who described him as disciplined and honorable. The contrast was striking. The jury, ordinary citizens tasked with weighing the evidence, watched James with an air of respect that the HOA's polished statements could not match. Weeks passed in this rhythm of arguments and rebuttals, each side trying to build its narrative brick by brick. For James, it was exhausting but purposeful. Each late night of preparation, each moment of scrutiny, reminded him that he was not only fighting for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of petty authority. Finally, after long deliberations, the courtroom entered its most decisive stage, closing arguments. The HOA's counsel pleaded with the court to see James's actions as dangerous precedent, warning that if rules could be ignored, the entire community would collapse into chaos. But James's lawyer delivered a counterpoint that echoed with moral clarity, that rules existed to protect, not to oppress, that power unchecked was not order but tyranny, and that the true danger lay not in one man raising a flag, but in an institution believing it could strip a homeowner of his rights without consequence. The words carried weight, and when the gavel struck to close the proceedings, the room exhaled in unison. The decision would not come immediately. The judge announced that he would take time to review all evidence before issuing a ruling. The waiting began. James returned home, his flag still waving proudly in the yard, though now watched by more eyes than ever before. Neighbors walked by slowly, some offering quiet nods, others avoiding his gaze, but all knowing that the fate of their community rested on what the court would decide. For James, the uncertainty was heavy, but it was not new. He had waited before for orders, for outcomes, for answers that could change lives. This was no different. He would endure the silence, knowing that whatever came next, he had stood tall, refusing to bow to intimidation. The HOA board, meanwhile, grew restless. Meetings behind closed doors grew louder, their once confident tone replaced by nervous calculation. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated how far he was willing to go, and now they feared the consequences of a verdict that might expose their abuses. The neighborhood lived in suspense, waiting for the day the judge would speak. And when that day finally came, the decision would send shockwaves far beyond a single street. The courthouse was packed on the morning of the verdict. The air was thick with anticipation, a blend of curiosity, fear, and hope that seemed to hang over everyone present. Neighbors who had once avoided the spectacle now crowded the benches, eager to witness the outcome of a battle that had grown larger than their cul-de-sac. Reporters lined the back rows, their cameras poised, ready to capture the moment justice would speak. James Whitaker arrived in silence, walking with the steady composure of a man who had long ago learned the power of patience. His suit was pressed, his eyes calm, though the lines on his face carried the weight of sleepless nights. He had prepared himself for any outcome, victory or defeat. He would face it with dignity. The HOA board members entered together, their shoulders squared, but their expressions betraying unease. Weeks of scrutiny had left cracks in their carefully constructed image. The board president clutched a folder of documents. Though she knew their relevance had already passed, the decision was no longer in their hands. When the judge entered, the room fell into silence. Papers shuffled, pens clicked, and then even those sounds disappeared. Everyone sat frozen, waiting for the ruling that would decide not just the fate of James's home, but the balance of power in their community. The judge's words were deliberate, each sentence landing like a hammer against stone. He began by outlining the facts, the timeline of notices, the escalation of fines, the filing of liens, and the foreclosure proceedings. He acknowledged the HOA's authority to maintain standards, but stressed that such authority was not absolute. Rules, he declared, were meant to preserve harmony, not to justify abuse. Then came the heart of the decision. The court found that the HOA had acted unlawfully in its foreclosure of James's property. Procedures had been bypassed. Proper notice had not been given. Fines had been applied disproportionately, not as a means of maintaining order, but as a weapon of punishment. The seizure of James's home was declared invalid, and full ownership was restored to him. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously, neighbors exchanged glances, and the board members sat stunned. The board president's face flushed, her jaw tightening as she realized the implications. But the judge was not finished. He went further, ordering the HOA to pay damages to James for the stress, legal costs, and emotional toll their actions had caused. He emphasized that power must be exercised with responsibility, and when abused, it would be held accountable. His final words echoed with finality. This court will not allow authority to become tyranny. The gavel struck, and the decision was sealed. The room erupted in whispers and murmurs. James sat still for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. He had fought, and he had won. Slowly, he stood, and though he did not smile or raise his fists in triumph, the quiet strength in his posture spoke volumes. He had reclaimed not only his home, but his dignity. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, microphones reached forward, and voices shouted questions. James spoke briefly, thanking his attorney, the court, and those who had supported him. He made no boastful remarks, only a simple reminder that no one should fear standing up for their rights. His words were clipped, but their impact was undeniable. The neighborhood, however, was not prepared for the fallout. The verdict spread like wildfire. Homeowners whispered excitedly, some celebrating the victory, others worrying about what it meant for the future. For years, the HOA had been untouchable, its authority unquestioned. Now, with a single decision, its power had been fractured. The board scrambled to respond. Emergency meetings were called, but attendance was sparse. Homeowners who once cowered now demanded answers. They questioned the validity of past fines, the fairness of rules, and the accountability of those who had enforced them. The board president attempted to assert control, but her words carried little weight. The confidence that once surrounded her had evaporated. Some board members quietly considered resigning, unwilling to face the scrutiny that was sure to follow. Others doubled down, vowing to regain control. But the unity that had once given the HOA its strength was dissolving. They were no longer feared, only resented. James returned home to find his flag still waving proudly in the breeze. Neighbors approached him, cautiously at first, then with more warmth. They congratulated him, thanked him, and some even admitted that his fight had given them courage. For the first time in a long while, James felt not like an outcast but like a neighbor truly welcomed. Yet he also understood that the battle was not over. The verdict was clear, but the wounds it exposed would take time to heal. The HOA had been dealt a crushing blow, but it was not gone. Its leaders would regroup, its defenders would plot, and the community would have to decide what kind of neighborhood it wanted to be moving forward. As evening fell, James sat on his porch with his dog at his side, the setting sun casting long shadows across the street. He looked at his home, his garden, the flagpole that had started it all, and felt a sense of peace he had nearly forgotten. But even in peace, he knew the struggle was not yet complete. The HOA had lost in court, but the true test was whether the neighborhood would learn from it or whether those in power would find new ways to tighten their grip. James had won a battle. The war for the soul of the community was just beginning. The verdict had shaken the neighborhood to its core. What had once been a place of silent compliance now buzzed with a restless energy. For years, the HOA had operated unchecked, enforcing rules with little resistance. But James's victory had shattered that illusion. Residents, who had quietly endured the fines, warnings, and humiliation, now realized they were not powerless. Almost overnight, the tone of the community shifted. Homeowners began questioning the board in ways they never had before. Letters poured into the HOA office, not from individuals fearful of punishment, but from groups demanding reform. At community meetings, voices once timid now spoke loudly, asking why they had been fined for harmless decorations, why liens had been threatened for small delays in payment, and why board members had acted with impunity for so long. The board president, once a figure of authority, found herself on the defensive. Her sharp lectures and condescending tone no longer silenced the crowd. Instead, each meeting devolved into confrontation. Homeowners demanded transparency, financial records, and accountability for years of questionable practices. The confidence she had wielded like a weapon now only fueled resentment. Behind the scenes, the board fractured. Some members argued for stepping down, claiming the damage was irreparable. Others insisted on doubling down, trying to restore order through stricter enforcement. The unity that had made the board so intimidating was gone. Each argument leaked into the community, fueling more distrust. James, meanwhile, had no desire to become the face of a movement, but the role was thrust upon him. Neighbors sought him out for advice, asking how he had stood up to the board, how he had managed to endure the endless pressure. Some even asked if he would consider running for a seat on the board himself. He declined politely, preferring his quiet life, but his very presence became a reminder that the HOA could be challenged and defeated. Local media continued to follow the story, and soon, it spread beyond their town. Across the state, homeowners wrote letters of support, sharing their own horror stories of HOA abuse. National outlets picked it up, framing James as an unlikely hero of suburban resistance. For many, he became a symbol of something larger, a fight not just against one association, but against the culture of unchecked authority that HOA letters represented. This growing attention only deepened the cracks within the neighborhood. Some residents welcomed the change, excited by the possibility of reform. Others resented the spotlight, feeling exposed and unsettled by reporters occasionally appearing on their streets. A once quiet and controlled community was now a place of tension, with lines drawn between those who wanted to move forward and those who clung to the past. For James, the days following the verdict were bittersweet. He cherished the peace of his home, the simple joy of working in his garden or walking his dog without fear of harassment. Yet he also knew his name carried weight now. When neighbors stopped to talk, their eyes carried gratitude, but also expectation, as if waiting for him to lead them further. It was not a role he wanted, but it was one he could not entirely escape. The HOA, desperate to salvage what little authority remained, began sending out new notices. They framed them as gentle reminders, but the community saw them for what they were: attempts to reassert control. This time, however, residents did not comply. Fines went unpaid, demands were ignored, and board members were openly mocked in group conversations. The tools of intimidation had lost their edge. Rumors of a recall election began to spread. Petitions circulated quietly at first, then openly. The prospect of removing the current board entirely gained momentum with each passing week. Those who once feared retaliation now felt emboldened, inspired by James's stand. The board president fought against it, warning of chaos and collapse if their leadership were stripped away. But her warnings sounded hollow. The more she spoke, the more residents rallied against her. What had once been her kingdom was slipping through her fingers. Amid the turmoil, James remained steady. He did not campaign. He did not lead rallies, but he offered quiet encouragement to those who asked. He knew that the true power of the community lay not in him, but in their willingness to act together. Yet beneath the surface, he sensed something darker. The board, humiliated and desperate, would not go down quietly. He noticed the way certain members avoided him. Their eyes filled not with defeat, but with bitterness. He heard whispers that the board was considering legal counteractions, appeals. or even personal suits against him, their power was diminished. But their pride was not broken. The neighborhood stood at a crossroads. Change was within reach, but the fight was not yet over. The HOA had lost a battle, but its leaders were determined to claw back control by any means necessary. James, sitting on his porch as autumn leaves scattered across his lawn, understood the truth. His lawsuit had ended, but the war for the neighborhood's future was only beginning.
The weeks following the verdict were turbulent. The once quiet community had become a battlefield of clashing voices, petitions, and hurried meetings. The HOA, desperate to salvage control, grew increasingly erratic in its actions. Notices were sent with harsher language, new rules were drafted hastily, and whispers circulated that the board was considering an appeal. But each attempt to tighten their grip only fueled more resistance. The recall petition reached a tipping point. What began as a few neighbors discreetly collecting signatures grew into a movement that swept across the neighborhood. Doors that once closed quickly to avoid confrontation now opened eagerly, homeowners adding their names in bold strokes. The board could no longer ignore it. A special meeting was scheduled a final confrontation where the fate of the HOA's leadership would be decided. The meeting hall was packed on the evening of the vote. Folding chairs filled every corner, neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, and the air vibrated with anticipation. James arrived quietly, taking a seat near the back. He had no intention of speaking unless asked, but his presence alone drew nods and whispers. For many, he was the reason they were there at all. The board president opened the meeting with the same commanding tone she had used for years. She lectured the crowd about order, about the necessity of rules, about the dangers of rebellion. Her words were sharp, but the crowd did not cower. Instead, murmurs of dissent rose, voices challenging her claims. For the first time, she was no longer in control of the room. When the floor was opened for discussion, residents stepped forward one by one. They spoke of years of fines and intimidation, of sleepless nights worrying about foreclosure, of the humiliation of being treated like children in their own homes. Their voices cracked with emotion, but carried a strength that could not be silenced. Each testimony was a nail in the coffin of the board's authority. Finally, a homeowner asked James to speak. He rose slowly, the room falling into silence as all eyes turned to him. He did not deliver a fiery speech or make bold promises. Instead, he spoke plainly, reminding everyone that the community was theirs, not the board's. Not a set of rules, but a collection of families who deserved respect and fairness. He told them that standing up had not been easy, but it had been necessary. His words, steady and sincere, resonated deeper than any argument that night. The vote was called, ballots were cast, collected, and counted under the watchful eyes of residents who no longer trusted blind authority. When the final numbers were read, the result was undeniable. The board was dissolved, its president and members removed from power. A wave of relief swept through the room. Some cheered, others wept quietly, and a few simply stood in stunned silence at the reality of what had just happened. Years of fear had ended in a single decision. The HOA, once feared as an untouchable force, was now broken. In the days that followed, an interim committee was formed, made up of ordinary residents committed to rebuilding trust. They promised transparency, fairness, and a focus on community rather than control. It would not be easy. The scars of mistrust ran deep, but for the first time in years, hope returned to the neighborhood. The former board president, humiliated and bitter, left the community soon after. Others faded into quiet lives, unwilling to face the neighbors who had turned against them. The reign of intimidation had ended, and with it, the fear that had shadowed every front porch and mailbox. James returned to his quiet routine, relieved to step out of the spotlight. His flag still waved proudly, undisturbed, a symbol not only of his service but of his victory. Neighbors greeted him warmly now, stopping to chat, offering baked goods, or simply thanking him for giving them courage. He accepted their kindness graciously, but never boasted. For him, the fight had never been about glory, it had been about dignity. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the flag caught the golden light, James sat on his porch with his dog at his feet. The air was calm, the streets quiet, the neighborhood at peace. He thought back to the battles he had fought, both overseas and here at home, and felt a profound sense of closure. The HOA had tried to strip him of his home, his sanctuary, his independence, but in the end they had only strengthened his resolve. He had faced them, he had endured, and he had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced. For James Whitaker, this was more than a legal victory. It was a reminder that even in the quiet suburbs, where the battles are fought with papers instead of weapons, courage still mattered. And sometimes the greatest victories came not from fighting for a nation, but from defending the right to call a house a home. As night settled and the last traces of sunlight faded, James leaned back in his chair, content. The war was over. His home was safe, and for the first time in a long while, peace truly felt earned.